Hi, this is Steven here with Reading with Steven. And this is the next video in Bookshelf A to Z series where I read all of the fiction books I own from A to Z. And today's episode is The Ultimate Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which is all five Douglas Adams novels collected together into one convenient book. These novels were written between 1979 and 1992. And before I began reading them, I just thought they were, it's funny British humor, kind of thing. But what struck me was, while reading them and then thinking about it afterwards, was just how postmodern they were and we'll discuss postmodernism in a minute, but it was surprising to me that something so silly, something so, well known within the public sphere of knowledge, I feel, was as postmodern as it was, and more importantly, was as philosophical as it was, or as it is, rather, I should say. Science fiction is a very philosophical genre of book, but I feel like this is a very good introduction for the ideas of postmodernism and for the ideas of existentialism. So I said the novels were postmodern originally, and you might be confused about that because you have no doubt heard about postmodernism from, I will be polite and say, intellectually dishonest people. And I mean that they're intellectually dishonest because I think they know that what they're doing is lying, but they're doing it anyway, for their own reasons. And I say that because postmodernism is not, all that ails society. It is not destroying Western civilization. It is not, turning men into women and women into men or anything of that sort. It is, for our purposes, it is an artistic movement, which is very hard to classify. The difficulty of classifying what exactly it is why these intellectually dishonest people can, lay all of the ills of society upon it. Because, if something can't be classified, it's easy to make up a classification for it. So we'll discuss how to classify what postmodernism is. But first, I think it's important to classify what modernism is. The problem with doing that is that modernism is not some prior movement. It is a movement that is still going on today, and thus somewhat difficult to classify what exactly it is. Right. So in the original recording of this video, I described modernism very poorly. And I want to make it clear that modernism, as an artistic movement, is not wholly dissimilar to postmodernism, insofar as how we understand it popularly. For example, stream of consciousness, free verse, are modernist literary forms, things which, in the popular understanding, we might consider to be postmodern, in their difficulty. But it is that difficulty which marks modernism versus postmodernism. I think if there is any sort of fast and easy rule for modernism versus postmodernism, is that modernism takes itself very seriously and holds itself above the popular fray, whereas postmodernism takes itself less seriously, still seriously, but less seriously, and embraces pop cultural art. So hopefully that's a little more clear. Postmodernism, however, unlike modernism, postmodernism is even harder to discuss because, as we, in our handy dictionary of literary terms and literary theory, It describes postmodernism with a general shrug of, hopefully one day we'll be able to come up with a definition. Our dictionary of critical theory does not leave us so in the lurch, however. It describes postmodern literature. It says that postmodern literature is such as Umberto Eco, Kurt Vonnegut, and Salman Rushdie, is that which deliberately and playfully employs paradox to display its own artificiality and contradictions, which plays with genre and its convention and alludes to both high and popular culture in such a way as to appeal to a very wide audience. An emphasis on the playful and popularity is a frequent theme in discussions of postmodernism, and a reminder that one of the objections to the modern has always been that it is difficult. We see in this definition that postmodernism, unlike modernism, has a tendency to be funny, or at least humorous, if not outright funny. Douglas Adams, as I said, is very funny and therefore fits right in, but that is not in and of itself enough. It needs to make it clear that it is self-knowing, right? Unlike the modernist, which is trying to portray itself as being an arbiter of truth, a postmodernist novel will acknowledge that A, it is a novel, B, it has absolutely no benefit of knowing what the truth is more than anything else, and C, it makes fun of the fact that it doesn't know, and it makes fun of the modernists for not knowing as well. This is all very confusing, and I'm sure there are going to be people who hear that my definition of it and go back and forth about whether it's accurate or not. But this is just a hard and fast thing. If you have a better definition, by all means, please leave it in the comments. I love talking about literature. I love talking about, postmodernism is an art movement, and I like talking about art, and I like talking about books. So please, feel free to leave it in the comments how you would describe postmodernism versus modernism. And who knows, maybe we'll come to a better understanding of life and of art. But I refer to this as a postmodernist novel because it is constantly making meta references. It makes references to itself. It references other works of science fiction. It references other things within British culture and Western culture as a whole. At one point, I said that Arthur and Ford go to a bar owned by Elvis. This has seemingly no other purpose than to be, hey, wink, wink. Here's a joke at the expense of people who think that Elvis is in space, still alive. There are jokes about sandwiches. There are jokes about sofas that are alive. And these are clearly intended to point to the artificiality of the novel, but also at the idea that it is ridiculous to think of the universe as being infinite. But even if it is infinite, then these ridiculous things must exist too, right? An infinite universe, there has to be a planet in which the oceans are made of jello. There has to be a planet on which your bedspread is a living creature that exists to be laid upon. And in doing so, it points to the ridiculousness of the idea of infinity, to the ridiculousness of being able to find meaning in infinity. And even still, it doesn't necessarily give up on that scope, but it does show that there is something fundamentally wrong with the idea of seeing a rationality in a distinctly irrational world. This is not the only postmodernist novel that we'll read. Obviously, there are other famous ones, such as, I don't know if it's in frame, it's not, but House of Leaves, famously postmodernist. It talks about academic literature and what even is a novel and all that stuff. I would argue that the Discworld series does something very similar, where it makes references and comes up with the ridiculousness of different situations within its genre and within its own novels and within our expectations of things and even within our own world. I think a really great example of postmodernism is actually the Monty Python movies. If you've ever seen those, the Monty Python and the Holy Grail ends with the actors in costume being arrested as if they had actually committed the crimes that they were supposed to have committed, which is obviously this, kind of set this idea that this movie is a movie about making movies in which people might have committed crimes, but obviously haven't committed crimes, because that's ridiculous. Because again, the point of at least this brand of postmodernism is to point out the ridiculous nature of the art forms in and of themselves. And I'm sure, again, in the comments, please leave other ideas on what postmodern movies and books you can think of. I think the books are harder to come up with solely because, you don't read as many postmodern novels. If you're like me, you don't read as many contemporary novels, high art contemporary novels. There's Infinite Jest. Infinite Jest is a postmodernist novel. Lolita, potentially. There's obviously Salman Rushdie, as I said, Umberto Eco. But here's one that I think is funny to think about, especially when you think about, the people who decry that postmodernism is coming to destroy civilization, is the Scary Movie franchise, which makes fun of the horror genre and makes fun of films and in a very irreverent manner. And the whole purpose of those is to just talk about how silly the horror genre is. And so just, next time you hear somebody talking about the ills of postmodernism on society, ask yourself, do you really think the Wayans brothers have it in for Western civilization? Do you think that Monty Python does? Do you think The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is bringing down, the American way of life? It really shows, I think, the intellectual dishonesty. It is, because they know better. How intellectually dishonest they are about postmodernism. Because it's not. It's just an art movement. And there will be other art movements afterwards. And, there are people who make fun of postmodernism in their art. And it continues. The cycle continues. With people having different ideas about what art is and what it can be. And none of them are inherently bad. They just are. Right, so after that long and confusing discussion on postmodernism, let's go into an equally long and equally confusing discussion of existentialism, shall we? Now, I am not a big fan of Nietzsche, which is okay, I suppose, but I do like Jean-Paul Sartre, which is convenient, because when we look at Jean-Paul Sartre, at our dictionary for critical theory, and its discussion on existentialism, it cites Jean-Paul Sartre, which I think is very astute of it, because I think Sartre, despite the fact that everybody knows about Nietzsche, I do think that Sartre is probably a little more influential in our understanding of existentialism. But I'm not a philosophy person, so take that with a grain of salt. But anyway, the dictionary quotes gives us an example of how Sartre viewed existentialism, saying, "Man is born into a kind of void, a mud. He has the liberty to remain in this mud and thus leave a passive, supine, acquiescent existence in a semi-conscious state, and in which he is scarcely aware of himself. However, he may come out of his subjective, passive situation, becoming increasingly aware of himself, and conceivably experience angoisse, a species of metaphysical and moral anguish. If so, he would then have a sense of the absurdity of his predicament and suffer despair. The energy deriving from this awareness would enable him to drag himself out of the mud and begin to exist. By exercising his power of choice, he can give meaning to existence in the universe. This definition perfectly actually encapsulates Arthur's journey through the first 4 novels. In the beginning of the first novel, obviously, he is ignorant of the universe as a whole, and literally is laying in the mud when Ford Prefect comes up to him and says, "Hey, let's go." Now, despite it being literally true, obviously, there is more to it. The first novel, the first and second novel, I should specify, we see Arthur coming to grips with the reality of a seemingly infinite, seemingly random, and uncaring universe. And he doesn't deal well with it. By the end of the second novel, and the beginning of the third novel, he has actually decided to go insane. Quote, "He stood up straight and looked the world squarely in the fields and hills. To add weight to his words, he stuck the rabbit bone in his beard. He spread his arms out wide. 'I will go mad,' he announced." Literally, Arthur decides that it is better to go mad than to continue dealing with the existential nature of the universe and his place within that universe. However, as the novel continues, he finds purpose. He finds purpose in stopping the cricketers from destroying the universe. He finds his place within the universe in doing so. And more importantly, he comes to accept the universe as it is, as in his place within the universe. So that by the beginning of the fourth novel, no longer is he this passive participant in the novels. No longer is he completely unaware of what is happening. No longer is he unable to fully participate in the plots of these novels. But by the fourth novel, he is now a seasoned hitchhiker, somebody who carries his own towel around, who is able to get from place to place without Ford Prefect helping him, who is able to become one with the universe in a way. He's able to communicate with the life on Earth in a way that he was unable to before. He's able to open up his consciousness. He's able to fly and all of that stuff, and all because he has come to terms with his existence, with his life. Or, as Sartre says, he is able to begin to exist. And he has the choice to give meaning to that universe. And he does so with Fenchurch. Fenchurch, he discovers, knows or at least theoretically knows the question of the universe, but instead of working with her to try to remember what the meaning of the universe is, they say it doesn't matter. It actually doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that if there is an answer to the universe, if there's a question to the answer 42. These things are intentionally unimportant. In fact, that's the reason Douglas Adams chose such a famously odd answer. The answer to the life, the universe, and everything is 42. And the reason it's 42 is because it is a nonsensical answer. Because there is no actual answer. And Douglas Adams knows that there is no answer. He knows that there is no answer. So we have the answer. But so he gives the silly answer 42, acknowledging that it is not his place to tell you what the point of the universe is. It is not his place to dictate what that is, if there is any. It is merely his place to bring to you, the reader, the idea that maybe there isn't one. Maybe, like Arthur, it turns out that there is no place for you. And maybe, like Arthur, actually, you need to make your own place. You need to find your own peace with the universe. You need to find your own sense of self-worth within that universe. To that point, we can see Arthur's character growth in the two women in his life. The two important women in his life. I suppose there is also random, but with Trillian and Fenchurch. Trillian, at the beginning of the novel, Arthur and Trillian knew each other before Trillian went off to space. And Arthur spent years thinking about this woman that didn't give him the time of day, didn't really think about him, and he spent years regretting that he didn't put himself more forward. But once he becomes a self-actualized, citizen of the universe, if you will, now no longer is he passively just accepting that he can't meet Fenchurch again. He's actively seeking her out. He's actively seeking out companionship and the people he wants to be with. And therein you can see not just that he has a different view on life, but he acts differently too, right? He acts in a way that he wants to find. No longer is he a passive recipient of the universe, of things that happen to him, but now he is an active participant in his own life, and an active participant within the universe, as dictated by The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And this is why, at the end of the fourth novel, when they meet Marvin the Depressed Robot, and they go to the planet where God has left his final words to the universe, there is not some great meaning. There is not some grand gesture or some grand statement by God. It is simply, we are sorry for the inconvenience. And it's why Marvin, the Depressed Robot, finds meaning in this too, because he realizes he's been searching, as it turns out, he's been searching for his place in the universe. He's been searching for what the point of anything is. Why was he gifted such a large intellect only to be subservient to these idiots? And it turns out there is no point. There is no point to it. You don't exist for a purpose. Marvin doesn't exist for a purpose. Arthur doesn't exist for a purpose. Fenchurch doesn't exist for a purpose. It is their own abilities. They exist, and therefore it is up to them to make their own existence, to give it meaning. And this is what Sartre is talking about with existentialism, and this is the point of existentialism. And it's why I find these novels to be, up through the fourth novel, to be very good, and it's why I find the fourth novel to be a very poignant and, I think, appropriate ending to the series, because it really comes full circle from, not knowing yourself, not knowing your place in the universe, not being even aware that the universe exists, to accepting of ourselves and accepting of where we are. And then comes Mostly Harmless, a novel which even Douglas Adams regretted writing the way he did. In one of the interviews he's given, he was quoted as saying, "For all sorts of personal reasons that I don't want to go into, I just had a thoroughly miserable year, and I was trying to write a book against that background, and guess what? It was a rather bleak book." There are some people who find Mostly Harmless to be a good novel. There are some people who find it to be an apt ending, unlike the fourth novel. And there are some people who think that it is... I think it'd be hard for us to find people who think that it's the best novel, but there are people who do like it. So I don't want to say that it is unlikable. There are humorous moments. I think when Arthur, seems to find art in the zen in the art of sandwich making, I think there's a very poignant moment, which is, of course, undercut by everything else that happens in the novel. Unlike the prior four novels, which I would argue are very existentialist, the fifth novel is actually nihilistic. And just so we're clear, it's existential nihilism. There are a number of different forms of nihilism. This particular one is existential nihilism, which makes sense given that the first four novels are existentialist. This one is existential nihilist. Existentially nihilist? I don't know what that word is supposed to be. But existential nihilism is just that unlike existentialism, which posits that there is no purpose, no set purpose in the universe for any one person, existential nihilism says not only is there no set purpose, but it is dumb and pointless to even comprehend that you could make up one. It is impossible to make up one, and you're just lying to yourself to try to cope, if you will. We can see this in when Arthur is talking to Ford, when he says, "Why do you need to think? Can't we just sit and go ba-dum, 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 ba-dum with our lips for a bit? Couldn't we just dribble gently and loll a little bit to the left for a few minutes? I can't stand it, Ford. I can't stand all this thinking and trying to work things out anymore. What is the point? We assume that every time we do anything, we know what the consequences will be, i.e. more or less what we intend them to be. This is not always correct. It is wildly, crazily, stupidly, cross-eyed, blithering, insectly wrong." Arthur, in the fourth novel, has had things happen so badly, things have gone so poorly for him now, that no longer does he see a point in continuing. No longer does he understand why bother going on. Why bother doing anything? Why continue? It's clear that there is no point. Not only he's been broken by the universe in this novel. It was a very depressing novel because of that. The problem with the nihilistic take, though, is that despite saying that there's no point in doing anything, despite all that, Arthur does continue to do things. He does continue to go on. He continues to find Random. He continues to try to help her and Trillian. Ford, who is also equally nihilistic in this novel, goes and meets Elvis for no other reason than because he wanted to meet Elvis. So it shows to a certain extent that the nihilism that the characters are spouting is not actually what they think. They are themselves coping with the fact that they can't come up with the reason, right? They have fallen back into that existential angoisse that Sartre is talking about. And it's not that they have given up searching. It's simply that what they thought they had, they didn't have. And this is the nihilistic take. But you might say, well, if they're truly nihilistic, why don't they just, end it all? And I did try to find up what the argument that nihilists have for that. Why you shouldn't, just move on. Their answer is that while there is no point to life, there's also no point to death either. And therefore, you might as well just continue. Which I think is a bold take. It's not one I agree with. It's such a stupid argument, to be honest. I couldn't believe I read it. I don't know. I'm a very optimistic person, although the people who know me may think otherwise, but I am. And I find that the fifth novel, is not very good because I think that it is not realistic. I don't think Arthur, having seen what the universe is capable of, wouldn't just give up, right? Like, if he truly loves Fenchurch, then he knows that she still exists somewhere. And the idea that he would just be like, to hell with it, I'll just make sandwiches. It just seems very silly. And the ending is also equally very silly. That that everyone dies. Everyone just dies. And I know it's very silly because even Douglas Adams thinks it's a bad ending. He rewrote when the radio play for Mostly Harmless comes out, he changes the ending because he acknowledges that the ending's not very good. It's not in keeping with the rest of the novel series. Mostly Harmless is a bad novel, not because it's nihilistic. One can be nihilistic and still be good, but it's bad because it contradicts the rest of the novels. And I think that makes it bad. And I just don't like it. I don't like nihilism. I don't like it. I proudly say that. Maybe you think otherwise, by all means, continue. But it just leaves, I don't know, it just leaves me with this kind of sense of, if there's no purpose, then why is Arthur and Ford doing the things they do? Why don't they just end up pulling a Bartleby the Scrivener and just doing nothing, literally doing nothing until you starve to death, as happens in Bartleby the Scrivener. Spoilers for the 200-year-old short story there. It just rings very false. It rings, I mean, it's, the novel's written like Douglas Adams was depressed at the time, which he was, and that's what he came up with. And I think it's worse for it, and I think it's unfortunate that a novel series so good, so funny, and so philosophical ends with, not with a triumphant moment, but rather with a poof. So, on the whole, I think these books surprised me. They were much better than I thought they were going to be. Much more interesting than I thought they were going to be, especially after the first novel. The first novel was funny, but it kind of left me feeling a little cold in the sense that I wasn't sure what the purpose of it was. But by the fourth novel, I liked it. And while I said that I don't like the fifth novel, I thought the experience as a whole was positive. And I'm happy that I finally got around to reading them. I've had these books since... I mean, I must have owned these... I must have gotten these books around like 2005, 2006 when the movie came out. And I just never read them. So we're going on 20 years I haven't read these novels that I've owned. And I'm happy that I got the opportunity to do it. And I'm happy that I got to talk about it and read about it. And honestly, I'm kind of happy I didn't read them at the time, because I would never have gotten the philosophical undertones that were going on. I would have never understood Arthur's journey. I wouldn't have understood the importance of Arthur and Fenchurch finding each other in the fourth novel. I wouldn't have gotten it. And I saw that because obviously before I make these videos, I go online and I see what other people are thinking about when they read about the novels and write about them. And a lot of people didn't like the fourth novel because it didn't seem to matter. Because it wasn't the space comedy that they were looking for. And I recognize that that's true. And I feel for those people because it isn't. But at the same time, you have to understand that it is thematically fitting. And I think that was the important thing. And that's why Douglas Adams wrote it in. But I was pleased with the novels. This is not going to be as true for our next novel, which is The Goblin Emperor by Catherine Addison. It'll be the next video, which will probably come out pretty soon. Sooner than this one came out, because I've already finished reading it. But this novel, unlike Hitchhiker's Guide, this novel I did not care as much for. But that is a different video. And I look forward to making it and talking about it. And I hope that you will leave comments about Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And I hope you'll join me with The Goblin Emperor. So if you would be so good as to read that, I think we can have a good discussion about it. And I look forward to it. Please leave any comments, questions, concerns. Not concerns. Don't leave concerns. I'm not interested in your concerns. But I am interested in your comments and questions, because I make these videos because I want to talk about books. And if nobody's leaving comments, then I can't talk about books. It's just me talking into the void. Me looking at my phone camera, and being like, hey. So I hope you do leave some videos. Or some videos. Some comments. Like, subscribe, do all that jazz. You know what to do. I hope you enjoyed the videos. Thank you for watching. Again, this is Reading with Steven. Go forth and find your purpose for existence.